What is the most secret thing a god has ever said? Not secret in the way that truths are guarded by priests, or locked in temple vaults, or written in languages no living person can any longer read. Secret in a different way. Secret the way the bottom of the ocean is secret. Not because no one has tried to reach it, but because the weight of everything above makes the descent nearly impossible for most. There is a moment in the Bhagavad Gita, a moment that most listeners pass through the way a sleeper passes through the deepest hour of the night, unaware that something extraordinary is occurring, where the God who has been speaking for 18 chapters pauses, and then he says quietly that what he is about to say next is the most confidential thing he has ever spoken in all of existence, in all of time. The great warrior Arjuna was there. The armies of two worlds stretched behind him. The sun was holding. The birds had gone silent. And the god in the charioteer's body said, "This is the highest secret of all. I am telling it to you because I love you." The sages who recorded this moment did not embellish it. They did not need to. They simply wrote down what happened. And then, for the next several thousand years, human beings read those lines and disagreed about what they meant. Scholars argued. Traditions divided. Even the greatest minds to have touched this text admitted, in their quietest moments, that something in the final teaching of Krishna remained beyond what any commentary could fully reach. The Devas themselves, those luminous beings who move through the higher worlds, are said in certain Puranic traditions to have listened to the transmission at Kurukshetra from their positions beyond the visible sky, straining, the way you strain to hear music drifting through a wall from another room. And even they, those ancient, radiant intelligences, could not fully enter what was being given. Not even the gods understood. Close your eyes for a moment and imagine the night sky as it appeared over the Gangetic plain in the last centuries of the Dwapara Yuga. No cities swallowing the dark with their light. No machinery filling the air with its constant restless hum. Just the vast breathing dark above and the river below, and the sound of wind in tall grass, and the stars, so many stars, and so close, that a person standing alone in a field might reasonably feel that the sky was not above them at all, but around them, as if they stood inside something vast and luminous and watching. The rishis, those ancient seers, who sat at the edges of rivers and let silence speak through them, looked up at that sky and knew, with a certainty that required no argument, that what looked back at them was not empty. Something was there, something patient, something that had waited a very long time and was now, slowly, moving toward what it had waited for. This is where the story of the Bhagavad Gita actually begins. Not on the battlefield of Kurukshetra, long before that. In the breathing darkness before the age when darkness became dominant. The Bhagavata Purana, one of the 18 great Mahapuranas, and composed in the Sanskrit that the sage Vyasa is said to have assembled as the Dwapara Yuga drew toward its trembling close, does not begin with Krishna's birth the way a biography begins. It begins with a question. The sage Shonaka and his companions are sitting in the Naimisha forest, preparing for a 12-year sacred gathering, and they ask the storyteller Sutta a question so direct, it seems almost too simple for the occasion. Of all things a person might hear in this life, what is the most worth hearing? Sutta's answer takes 12 books and 18,000 verses to complete. But buried within that vast answer, past the cosmologies, past the lineages of kings and sages, past the accounts of creation and dissolution and creation again, is a declaration so radical that it altered the entire architecture of Hindu thought. And the Bhagavata Purana states, not metaphorically, not as one interpretation among many, but as its central and foundational claim, that Krishna is not an avatar of Vishnu in the ordinary sense. Krishna is not a descent of Vishnu. Krishna is the source from which Vishnu himself emerges. The Purana's hierarchy of divinity inverts at this declaration. The avatars, the text says, are like sparks. Krishna is the fire from which the sparks arise. The first verse of the Bhagavata Purana, the very first verse, is an invocation to what it calls Satyam Param, the supreme truth. And that supreme truth, the text will spend 12 books demonstrating, is not an abstract principle. It is not a philosophical position. It is a person. A person who once walked through the streets of Mathura and Dwaraka and Vrindavan, who ate at tables and danced at festivals and laughed with cowherd children, who held a flute made from a reed and played music that, if you heard it, made you forget everything you had ever believed about the separation between the world and the sacred. This matters. It matters in a way that extends far beyond theology and religious debate. It matters because of what it implies about what happened at Kurukshetra. If the being who sat in that chariot, holding those reins, speaking with such quiet precision to a trembling warrior, if that being was not a messenger from the divine, but the divine itself, wearing the thinnest possible veil of human form, then every word spoken in those hours carries a weight that no ordinary teaching can carry. Not the weight of wisdom, the weight of a universe speaking to itself. The Vishnu Purana, an older in its layers and more architecturally restrained, still bows in the same direction. It describes what it calls the Vyuhas, the cosmic emanations of the supreme reality, and places at their origin something it calls Vasudeva, not a name for a person in this context, but a name for the totality of being, the one in whom all things exist and from whom all things proceed, and toward whom all things are, whether they know it or not, returning. And it is this name, Vasudeva, that Krishna's father carries, and that Krishna inherits, and that the Bhagavad Gita uses in its most intimate and most devastating verses. The Mahabharata, that ocean of narrative in which the Bhagavad Gita moves like a single luminous current, contains a hymn delivered by the sage Narada in the hermitage of Nara and Narayana. The hymn does not describe a deity in the familiar iconographic sense. The four arms, the lotus, the conch, and disc, and mace, and flower. It describes a presence that is prior to all form, a stillness that contains all motion, a silence from which all sound has emerged, and to which all sound eventually returns. The hymn calls this presence Hari, and what the hymn is pointing at, if you listen to it long enough without trying to categorize it, is the same thing the Bhagavata Purana is pointing at. The same bottomless source that later, wearing human skin and carrying a flute, would stand in a field in Vrindavan and play music that made the cowherd women weep without knowing why. Sit with that for a moment. Sit with what it would mean to be that. Not to represent it, not to carry a portion of it, and the way a lamp carries light from a distant flame, but to be it, entirely and without remainder, while also being someone who laughs, while also being someone who runs through a field, while also being someone who sits with a suffering friend and says quietly, "I am here. Tell me what hurts." The Bhagavata Purana spends 4 entire books, thousands of verses, on Krishna's childhood in Vrindavan and Mathura. And what is striking, when you read those passages slowly and let them breathe, is that the miraculous deeds are not the main point. The demons defeated, the mountain lifted, the great serpent subdued, these are mentioned, yes, but they are not the heart of it. The heart of it is something quieter and stranger, and more difficult to explain in the vocabulary that ordinary religious experience provides. The heart of it is the rasa. Rasa is a Sanskrit word that resists simple translation. It means essence. It means juice, or the concentrated flavor of a thing, the way the word for pomegranate juice and the word for dramatic feeling are, in Sanskrit, intimately related, because the ancient understanding held that all experience has a flavor, a particular quality that you taste rather than think. And in the context of the Bhagavata Purana's accounts of Vrindavan, rasa means something even more specific. It means the relational experience of the divine, not the divine observed from a safe philosophical distance, not the divine worshipped from the floor of a temple with protocol and hierarchical correctness, but the divine tasted intimately, personally, the way you taste salt on the wind that comes off the sea before you have even seen the water. The gopis of Vrindavan, those cowherd women whose love for Krishna became one of the most analyzed and celebrated themes in all of Sanskrit literature, describe something that even their own language cannot fully carry. They say the air changes when he is near. They say that time becomes strange, neither fast nor slow, but somehow both at once, the way a dream feels when you are deep inside it, and some quiet part of you knows you are dreaming, but cannot find the door back to waking. They say that ordinary things, the weight of clay pots on their heads, the smell of wet earth after rain, the particular quality of light at dusk over the Yamuna, that all of these ordinary, unremarkable things became, in his presence, saturated with something they had no word for. Not happiness exactly, something larger than happiness, but something that happiness is only the outermost and thinnest layer of. This is what the tradition calls Ananda, not pleasure, not contentment. Ananda, the bliss that is not an experience you have, but what you are beneath all experience. The ground of your existence expressing itself finally without obstruction. And what the Bhagavata Purana is trying to say through all those thousands of verses about a cowherd boy playing a flute by a river is that this is what contact with the real Krishna was. Not contact with a powerful being who could defeat enemies and lift mountains. Contact with the source of your own deepest nature, recognized in another form. The Mundaka Upanishad speaks of two birds sitting together on the branch of the same tree. One bird eats the fruit of the tree. The other simply watches, motionless, luminous, and neither eating nor not eating, simply present. The Upanishad says these two birds are the individual self and the supreme self. And what the Vrindavan passages of the Bhagavata Purana are describing, though in the language of a love story rather than the language of philosophy, is the moment when the eating bird catches a glimpse of the watching bird and everything changes. Not because it has found something new, because it has recognized something it had always been carrying without knowing it. If you sit with the word rasa long enough, if you let it rest at the back of your mind, the way a low bell note rests in the air after it has been struck, slowly dissolving into the room, something begins to shift. You begin to understand, or to sense, or to feel at the edge of understanding why Krishna came when he came. Why he came specifically in the Dwapara Yuga, at the hinge point between the age of partial light and the age of coming darkness. Why the Bhagavad Gita is not, in its essence, a philosophical treatise. Why it is something else, something that philosophy points toward but cannot become. He did not come to correct an idea. He came to transmit a rasa. The difference is everything. A philosophy can be written down and pass through centuries unchanged. A rasa can only be received. You cannot argue your way into it. You cannot study your way into it. Not exactly, not in the direct transactional sense. It arrives the way sleep arrives, not when you force it, but when something in you finally, quietly, without fanfare, stops resisting what was always already present. Think of the ocean. You have read about it, and someone who loves you has described the sound of it, the scale of it, what it does to the horizon at dusk. All of that knowledge is real. None of it is wrong. But the first time you stand at the edge of it, barefoot, the cold wet sand under your feet, the sound arriving not through your ears, but through the whole surface of your body. All of that secondhand knowledge does not disappear. It transforms. It becomes the scaffolding that helps you recognize what you are standing inside of. The knowledge and the presence meet, and something new and inexpressible emerges from their meeting. This was Vrindavan, and Kurukshetra was what came after Vrindavan, when the world that contained Vrindavan was ending, and something had to be said before the light changed. Here is what the tradition almost never says plainly, because it is counterintuitive enough to disturb people who have arranged their understanding of the Bhagavad Gita into comfortable order. Arjuna did not fully receive the transmission in the moment it was given. This is not a failure of Arjuna. The Mahabharata is meticulous in establishing who Arjuna was. He was the son of Indra. He had stood in the court of Shiva without being destroyed, which is itself a thing almost no being in any world can claim. He was the most accomplished archer of his age, which is to say, the most accomplished at the particular discipline that his age considered the highest expression of human excellence. If any human being living in the last years of the Dwapara Yuga was capable of receiving the full depth of what Krishna was transmitting in those hours on the battlefield, it was Arjuna. And still, after the teaching was complete, after Krishna had spoken the final words, and the conches had blown, and the vast machinery of the war had begun to move, Arjuna fought. He did what warriors do. He used strategy and calculation and force. The ecstatic surrender that the final verses of the Bhagavad Gita describe, the surrender that, if it had fully opened in him, would have made strategy and calculation secondary to a deeper intelligence. That surrender did not fully blossom in him on that day. This is not a tragedy. It is an instruction. The Brihadaranyaka Upanishad, one of the oldest of the Upanishads, vast as a forest, dense with the kind of thinking that requires the mind to become very quiet before it can receive, speaks of how the highest teachings function, not as immediate illumination, not as a switching on of a light that was previously off, but as what might be called an installation, something placed in the deepest layer of awareness, below the reach of argument and analysis, where it grows slowly, across this life and perhaps across others, until the conditions are exactly right, and what was planted simply opens, the way a seed that has waited through an entire winter opens when the first warm rain touches the ground above it. The Bhagavad Gita was not delivered only to Arjuna. It was planted in every awareness it would ever reach, including, quietly and without ceremony, the one listening now. And yet, before we can understand what those final verses contain, before we can follow Krishna to the exact edge of what language is capable of carrying, and stand there with him, and in the silence before the most confidential word, we must understand the world that made that moment necessary. We must understand what the Dwapara Yuga was in its fullness before the cracks appeared, what it felt like to live in a world where the sacred was still close enough to touch, what human beings lost, slowly and then all at once, when that world began to end. What is it like when the light begins to change? What does the world look like in the last seasons of a god's time on earth? Picture a field at dawn, before the armies have moved into position, before the great conches have split the air. Picture the dew still on the grass, and the light coming in low from the east, and the elephants swaying in their formations, and the horses making small nervous sounds, and 200 miles of human beings in armor holding their breath. And in the center of all of it, in a chariot drawn by white horses, positioned in the no man's land between two impossible walls of assembled humanity, a man is falling. Not falling physically, falling inward. Arjuna's bow is slipping from his hands. His palms are wet. His legs will not hold him. He has been to war before. He has fought in conditions that would have broken most beings in any world. But he has never been to this, to the particular quality of collapse that arrives not from fear of dying, but from a sudden, annihilating clarity about the cost of winning. He looks across the field. He sees his grandfather Bhishma. He sees his teacher Drona, whose hands taught those very hands to draw a bowstring. He sees cousins, uncles, beloved companions, and something in him breaks open, not in the way that courage breaks, but in the way that certainty breaks. the thing that was supporting the whole architecture of his life, his identity as a warrior, as someone who knew his function in the world and was equal to it, simply gives way. He sits down in the chariot, and the God who has been waiting for this moment since before time began begins to speak. The first chapter of the Bhagavad Gita is called Arjuna Vishada Yoga. Vishada means grief, despondency, the particular anguish that arrives when everything you have built your life's meaning upon suddenly appears as what it is, contingent, fragile, insufficient, in the face of what is being asked of you. The chapter is sometimes dismissed by commentators as merely the setup, the narrative frame that makes the teaching necessary. But sit with it long enough, and you begin to suspect that the first chapter is not the setup. It is the teaching. Everything that follows is the unpacking of what that grief contains. Because Arjuna's grief, as the Gita renders it, is not ordinary sadness. It is a very specific and very ancient human problem. It is the problem of a being who has arrived at the moment where the life they were living and the life they are being called to live cannot coexist, where the self that got them this far is not the self that can carry them through what comes next. This is not a warrior's crisis. This is the crisis, the one that arrives for every human being, in every age, in 1,000 different settings and disguises. The moment where something in you knows, with a certainty that no argument can touch, that you are standing at a threshold, and that crossing it will cost you the version of yourself you have been, and there is no way to know yet what you will be on the other side. The Mahabharata, in the Bhishma Parva, where the Gita appears, tells us that Sanjaya, the minister of King Dhritarashtra, gifted by the sage Vyasa with divine vision so that he could narrate the war to his blind king without being present at it, that Sanjaya pauses before he reports Arjuna's collapse. There is a quality in Sanjaya's narration at that moment, if you read the original Sanskrit and let it slow down in you, of someone who has seen something they were not quite prepared to see. Arjuna falling apart is supposed to be impossible, and yet here it is, happening, and what Sanjaya is watching is not a warrior's failure. What Sanjaya is watching is the precise, necessary, and divinely arranged unraveling of a human ego at the moment when a god has decided to speak the unspeakable. The Katha Upanishad, one of the most beloved of the Upanishads, the one in which the god of death himself becomes the teacher, says something that the first chapter of the Bhagavad Gita seems to be enacting. It says that the self, the Atman, cannot be known through extensive learning. It cannot be known through great intelligence. It cannot be forced open by the effort of the mind. It reveals itself, and this is the phrase that matters, to the one it chooses. Nayam atma pravakanena, labyo na medhaya, na bahuna shrutena. Not by discourse, not by intellect, not by much learning, only to the one it chooses. And what does it choose? What quality in a being makes it eligible for the deepest reception? The Katha Upanishad does not give a list of virtues. It says, in the verse immediately following, that the one chosen is the one to whom the Atman reveals its own nature, which is, admittedly, circular in a way that is either maddening or liberating, depending on where you stand. But what the Bhagavad Gita seems to suggest, through the story of Arjuna's collapse and what follows it, is this. The eligibility is created by the breaking. The grief is not an obstacle to the teaching. The grief is the opening through which the teaching enters. Consider what the Dwapara Yuga meant as a context for this moment. Sri Yukteswar Giri, in his extraordinary work The Holy Science, describes the yugas not as arbitrary periods of mythological time, but as phases of cosmic expansion and contraction, corresponding to our solar system's position relative to what he calls the grand center, that luminous point around which all of creation revolves in a cycle spanning 24,000 years. In the ascending Treta Yuga, he writes, human beings possessed faculties of perception that we in the Kali Yuga can barely imagine. Not supernatural, natural, but natural at a different order of magnitude. The capacity to perceive finer and finer layers of reality was simply available, the way our capacity to see the gross physical world is available to us now. To see an aura was as ordinary as seeing a face. To know another's thought was as unremarkable as hearing their voice. By the Dwapara Yuga, the descending phase, some of that perception remained, but was becoming effortful, fragile, maybe dependent on practice and lineage and the right conditions. The rishis, who sat at the edges of rivers and allowed silence to speak through them, were not doing something anyone could do with a morning's effort. They were preserving, through extraordinary discipline, a capacity that had once been the natural inheritance of the species, and by the end of the Dwapara Yuga, by the time Arjuna sat in that chariot with his bow falling from his hands, something fundamental was shifting in the fabric of what human awareness could receive. The signal was still broadcasting. The gods had not abandoned the frequency, but the receiver was becoming unreliable. The antenna was bending. And what Krishna knew, sitting in that chariot with the reins in his hands, was that there would not be another opportunity like this one. Not for a very long time, and not until the wheel had turned through the full darkness and the Satya Yuga was again ascending, and a different kind of human being would stand in a different field and be capable of receiving in full what Arjuna was about to receive only partially. The Vishnu Purana speaks of the ages not with grief, but with a kind of vast impersonal patience. Empires rise and dissolve, civilizations flower and are forgotten. The very mountains eventually descend into the sea, and then, after an unimaginable interval, the mountains rise again. What appears to be loss from inside the loss is, from a larger perspective, simply the held breath between one exhale and the next inhale of creation, the contraction before the expansion, the winter that makes the spring possible. But you can know that intellectually and still feel the weight of the contraction when you are inside it. Arjuna knew it. He sat in the chariot and felt the weight of an entire age ending in his body. What Krishna does next is one of the most analyzed sequences in the history of human thought. 16 chapters of argument, analogy, instruction, cosmology, devotion, revelation. He does not begin with the most confidential teaching. He begins where Arjuna is, in the grief, in the confusion, in the particular darkness of a person who has lost their orientation and does not yet know that losing their orientation was the necessary precondition for finding something more real. He begins with Dharma, which in the Bhagavad Gita means not merely duty in the social sense, but the deepest organizing principle of a being's existence, the particular note in the cosmic chord that only you can sound, without which the chord is incomplete. He argues. He uses logic. He meets Arjuna's mind, where Arjuna's mind actually is, which is in the discursive, questioning, resistant mode that the mind always adopts when it senses that what is being asked of it will cost it its current form. The Chandogya Upanishad, one of the oldest and most expansive of the Upanishads, containing within its vast pages the teaching of Tatvamasi, that art thou, the declaration that the individual self and the universal self are not two different things, but one thing seen from two different angles, describes how a teacher works with a student who is not yet ready for the final teaching. You do not begin with the final teaching, you begin with what they can hold. And then, slowly, with great care and great patience, and a love that has no agenda and no timetable, you introduce each subsequent teaching as a step on a path that only reveals itself as a path once you have already walked a significant portion of it. This is what the 18 chapters of the Bhagavad Gita are, a path that reveals itself one step at a time to an Arjuna who is in too much pain to see where he is going. Chapter 2 brings the Sankhya philosophy, the analysis of what is real and what is not, like what endures and what dissolves. The body dies. The Atman does not die. What you are afraid of losing is not, in the deepest sense, what you are. This is logical. Arjuna can receive it with his mind. Chapters 3 and 4 bring karma yoga, the yoga of action performed without attachment to its fruits. This is subtler. This requires not just intellectual agreement, but a different relationship to doing itself. The ego performing actions for the ego's benefit, even when successful, generating the conditions for its own eventual exhaustion. The action performed as an offering, as a yajna, as a sacred fire into which the agent dissolves. This is different in kind, not just in degree. Arjuna can understand this mostly. He can nod. He is not yet living it. Chapters 5 through 12 move through progressively more interior territories. On meditation, the nature of the Supreme, the various forms in which the Supreme manifests. And then, in chapter 11, the thing that no chapter had prepared Arjuna for, Vishvarupa, the cosmic form, the moment when the charioteer removes the veil and shows Arjuna what is actually in that chariot. What Arjuna sees in the Vishvarupa defies the language even of the most accomplished Sanskrit poets. Vyasa tries. He gives us mouths containing worlds, eyes that are the sun and moon, a body whose radiance makes the ordinary light of 1,000 suns seem dim. He gives us time itself, devouring all of creation, the armies already destroyed in the mouth of what is looking at Arjuna with calm, infinite eyes. Arjuna begs for the vision to end. He cannot hold it. His human nervous system, even Arjuna's nervous system, so it is not built to sustain contact with the unfiltered real. And Krishna, with what can only be described as a tenderness that is the most extraordinary thing about the entire Gita, immediately contracts back into the form of a charioteer, puts the veil back on, holds the reins again. Because the teaching is not the vision is evidence. The teaching is something else, and it has not been given yet. It will not be given until the very last chapter, when Arjuna has been carried, slowly and carefully, through everything that his mind could receive, and arrives at the only place left to arrive. Here is the counterintuitive truth at the heart of the Bhagavad Gita, the one that most readings of it miss, because most readings are looking for instruction rather than transmission. The entire path of the Gita, on all 17 chapters that precede the final teaching, is not primarily a path toward the final teaching. It is a path of exhaustion, of the mind's exhaustion of its own strategies, of the self's exhaustion of all the things it believed would make it adequate to existence, knowledge, right action, devotion, vision, even the memory of having witnessed a God reveal the full depth of what it is. All of these are real. None of them is the final thing. The final thing cannot be reached. It can only be surrendered to. And surrendering to it requires having genuinely, not theoretically, not philosophically, but in your actual blood and bone and breath, requires having genuinely tried everything else. The Kali Santarana Upanishad, a text that feels like a whisper passed between very old friends, Itsua says something that seems almost too simple, that in the Kali Yuga, the age of darkness now fully descended, all the elaborate paths, the paths of knowledge and ritual and ascetic effort, are available and real and valuable, but functionally almost unreachable for most beings born into the conditions of this age. The mind is too turbulent, the attention span too fractured. The distance between where a person begins and where these paths require them to arrive is too great to cross in a single lifetime under ordinary conditions. And so the teaching had to be given differently, had to be planted at a depth where the turbulence of the surface mind cannot disturb it, had to be placed not in the part of Arjuna that argues and deliberates and weighs, but in the part of Arjuna that simply is, below the ego, below the personality. It's in the Atman itself, which does not receive transmissions because it already is the transmission. This is what happened in the last chapter of the Bhagavad Gita, and it is why, even now, thousands of years later, in a different age and a different world, under a sky whose stars seem farther away, and a darkness that seems more complete. Even now, the reading of those verses does something. Not always something that can be named, but something. A subtle reorganization in the deepest layer of awareness. A recognition that feels older than this life. A hand reaching across a distance that should not be crossable, and almost making contact. But why those particular words? Why that precise sequence of final teaching? Those specific verses in which a god strains against the limits of language to hand something to a human being who can only partially hold it. Why did Krishna choose to give the most confidential teaching in the most public possible setting, between two armies, with the battle drums already beaten and the elephants already aligned, with the entire watching world as witness? The answer to that question, and it is an answer that will reorganize everything you thought you understood about the Bhagavad Gita. There is a kind of light that exists only at the very end of a long day. The last few minutes before the sun finally crosses below the horizon, when the sky turns colors that have no exact name, and the quality of the air changes, becomes somehow both more present and more elegiac, as if the world is holding its breath and weeping and being beautiful all at once. Painters have chased this light for centuries. Photographers time their entire days around the hope of it. And yet no painting and no photograph has ever fully captured what it actually feels like to stand inside it, to have your skin touched by it, to know, without needing to be told, that it is ending, that what you are inside of right now is the last of something. This is the quality of the world in the final decades of Krishna's time on earth. Those who were alive in it did not have a word for what they were living through. They simply felt it, a particular texture of the days, a weight that was not sadness and not fear, but something that contained both. Something like the breath you hold when you are waiting for news you already know will change everything. This is where we find ourselves now, not at the battlefield, not in the teaching. After. The Mahabharata does not end with the war. The war ends in the 11th of 18 books, and what follows, 7 more books of aftermath, of grief and consequence, and the slow unwinding of a world is, in its way, as vast as the war itself. And at the end of all of it, there is a passage in the Mausala Parva, the Book of the Clubs, that stands as one of the most harrowing and most beautiful things in all of Sanskrit literature. It is the account of what happened 36 years after the Battle of Kurukshetra. It is the account of the end of the Yadava clan. It is the account of Krishna's departure from the world. The Mausala Parva begins with omens. The Bhagavata Purana, in its 11th book, gives these in careful detail, as if they are a kind of diagnostic. The signs by which a world can know that the sacred is preparing to withdraw. The sun rises and sets at wrong times. Animals behave in ways that violate their nature. Children are born with signs that the Vedic seers would have recognized as markers of an age changing at its foundations. Flies appear in numbers not seen before. The sacred fires at Dwaraka, those fires maintained through rigorous daily yajna, and said to be extensions of the cosmic fire from which all creation originally burst. Those fires begin to burn low, and to produce smoke that moves in wrong directions against the wind, as if the fire itself is uncertain. And then, the Yadavas, Krishna's own people, destroy each other. Not through enemy action, not through war. They destroy each other with reeds pulled from a sacred lake, reeds that, through a curse set in motion by the sages Vishwamitra, Kanva, and Narada, as a consequence of a jest performed by young Yadava men, mocking the dignity of the rishis. Those reeds had been transformed into iron clubs capable of killing. The Bhagavata Purana is precise about what happened, but it is also, if you read it with the kind of attention it requires, is saying something beyond the literal narrative. It is saying that the forces of dissolution in the Kali Yuga do not always arrive from outside. They arise from within, from the mockery of the sacred by those who should have known better, from the loss of viveka, that most essential of Sanskrit capacities, the capacity for discernment, for knowing the difference between what serves the real and what serves only the surface. Viveka. The word comes from the root vivik, meaning to separate or to distinguish. It is the faculty by which a human being can know, in any given moment, what is moving them toward their deepest nature and what is moving them away from it. The Viveka Chudamani of Shankaracharya calls it the first of the 4 qualifications necessary for the spiritual path. Without it, and even a direct encounter with the divine, even standing on a battlefield while a god speaks 18 chapters of cosmic truth into your ear, cannot be fully received, because the receiver must be oriented, the antenna must be aligned. What the Mausala Parva is describing beneath the surface of its narrative is the systematic loss of viveka in a world entering the full force of the Kali Yuga. Not the loss of intelligence, not the loss of capability, the loss of orientation, the loss of the ability to know which direction the sacred actually lies in, when everything around you is giving you confident signals in various contradictory directions. And in this world of failing orientation, the presence that had been holding everything in alignment by its sheer proximity, the presence that was the living source of all rasa, all viveka, the all orientation, that presence was preparing to withdraw. In the 36th year after Kurukshetra, after his people have destroyed each other, Krishna withdraws to a forest. He sits beneath a great tree, in a posture of absolute stillness, the posture the Upanishads call samadhi, that condition which is not a practice or an effort, but the natural state of awareness when all of the noise generated by mistaking the surface for the depth has finally fallen quiet. He sits, and he is present, and there is nothing in him that resists what is coming. A hunter mistakes his foot for a bird and shoots. This is the moment of departure. The Bhagavata Purana describes what the Devas, those luminous presences who move through the higher planes of creation, what they do in the moments following. Flowers fall from the sky. The air fills with a music that has no visible source, and then, gradually, the sky closes again, the way water closes over a stone dropped through its surface, and the world is left with its own weight. What the sacred texts are describing here is not a tragedy. Every master of this literature, from Shankaracharya to Madhvacharya to Ramanujacharya to the great Chaitanya Mahaprabhu, men who devoted their entire lives to understanding what the Bhagavata Purana is saying, all of them locate in this departure not an ending, but a transformation. The presence that was localized, embodied, audible and visible and touchable, that presence does not cease. It distributes. It becomes the ground of the world rather than a figure moving through it. It becomes what was always already the case, the substrate of all experience, and the ocean beneath all surfaces, now without the particular current that had briefly, gloriously, incomprehensibly gathered into the form of a person. The Brihadaranyaka Upanishad teaches this through an image that has stayed in the memory of every student who has sat with it long enough. It describes the Atman at the moment of the body's dissolution as a great fish moving from one bank of a river to another. The fish does not disappear. The water does not disappear. The movement itself does not disappear. What changes is simply the location. What changes is where, in the river, the particular concentration of aliveness can be found. But what is left behind after the great fish moves on? The teaching. And specifically, the last and most secret layer of the teaching, implanted so deep in the fabric of awareness that even the grinding force of the Kali Yuga cannot fully reach it. Sit with this for a moment, let it breathe. The Kali Yuga, as the Vishnu Purana describes it, is not simply an age of moral decline, though it is that. It is an age in which the very instruments of perception, the faculties by which a human being would normally be capable of receiving subtle transmissions, become progressively less reliable. The Satya Yuga, the age of truth, is the age in which the full range of human awareness is available, in which the signal and the receiver are perfectly matched, in which what the Rig Veda calls Rita, the cosmic order, the underlying rightness of things, is not a concept, but a direct, ongoing, unmediated experience. The Treta and Dwapara yugas represent progressive degrees of that matching becoming imperfect. The Kali Yuga is the age in which the matching is at its minimum. The signal is still broadcasting, has never stopped, will never stop. The source has no mechanism by which it can stop broadcasting itself, because the broadcast is not a thing it does. The broadcast is what it is. But the receiver has accumulated layers, interference, the noise of a civilization that has forgotten the frequency it was built to inhabit. And in the static of all that noise, the subtlest and most essential transmission, the one given in the final verses of the 18th chapter of the Bhagavad Gita, reaches most of us as something between a whisper and the memory of a whisper, something almost recognizable, something that makes the chest tighten with a longing that has no obvious object. Think of a lamp carried through a long dark corridor by someone who set out before you arrived at this place. You cannot see the lamp directly, but you can see the quality of light on the walls ahead, the way the shadows move, the faint warmth that lingers in the air where the lamp recently passed. This is the relationship that most people in the Kali Yuga have with the final teaching of the Bhagavad Gita, not the lamp itself, the trace of the lamp, the memory the walls hold of having been touched by something luminous. And yet, the Bhagavata Purana says something extraordinary in its last chapters, something that every student of the Kali Yuga must eventually sit with, that the Kali Yuga, for all its darkness, it contains within it a specific and unprecedented gift, that in this age alone, in this age of noise and forgetting and fractured attention, the act of simply speaking the names of the divine, simply holding the memory of the sacred in the mind, even for a moment, even imperfectly, even while distracted, carries a potency that would have required, in the Satya Yuga, elaborate lifetimes of practice to accumulate. The fire has burned low, but what a fire it still is when it burns. Now here is the turn that changes everything, the counterintuitive truth at the center of the cosmic withdrawal. Krishna did not leave because the world became unworthy. Every popular reading of the Kali Yuga narrative implies this or states it outright. The gods withdrew because humanity had failed. The sacred retreated because the sacred could not coexist with the increasing density and darkness of the descending ages. The light went out because the room became too dirty. But this is not what the Bhagavata Purana actually says, and it is not what the Vishnu Purana says, and it is not what you find when you read the Mausala Parva with the kind of attention that lets it speak rather than simply speak at you. What these texts are actually encoding, if you sit with them long enough, is something far more precise. Krishna did not withdraw from the world, he withdrew into the world. He withdrew from the visible and localized mode of presence into a mode of presence that is total, distributed, invisible to surface perception, and available. If you know how to listen, if your viveka is oriented correctly, in every moment, in every place, unto every being who reaches toward it with enough sincerity to cut through the interference. The Kena Upanishad asks a question that has no comfortable answer. If you know Brahman, you do not know it. If you do not know it, you know it. This is not a riddle designed to produce frustration. It is a map of how the deepest reality operates. It is accessible precisely in the place where the ordinary seeking mind runs out of strategies. The withdrawal was not a punishment. The withdrawal was an invitation to a different and deeper mode of reception. The signal did not stop. The station moved. And for those with the ears to hear, for those in whom something of viveka remains, even imperfect, even struggling against the noise of the age, the final teaching of the Bhagavad Gita is not a historical document about a conversation that happened 3,000 years ago. It is a live broadcast, now, tonight, in this moment. This is what the Seers were trying to tell us. What exactly did they encode in those final verses? What is the content, precisely, of the most confidential thing ever spoken? How did the rishis, those extraordinary beings who could hold the signal clean even in declining ages, understand what had been transmitted at Kurukshetra in a way that they felt compelled to preserve, to encrypt, to plant in layers of text that would survive even the darkest passage of the Kali Yuga? What is the actual secret? That is what comes next. Imagine a hand reaching across a distance that should not be crossable, not metaphorically, literally. Imagine the physical sensation of extending your hand in the dark towards something you can feel the presence of but cannot see, your fingertips brushing the very outermost edge of contact. This is the experience that the greatest commentators on the Bhagavad Gita describe when they speak of the 18th chapter's final teaching. Not the satisfaction of understanding, the sensation of contact, brief, charged, unmistakable, with something that is both infinitely close and, from the position of ordinary awareness, apparently infinitely far. The verse is Bhagavad Gita 1864. It comes after 17 chapters of progressive revelation. It comes after the Vishvarupa, after the teachings on jnana and bhakti and karma, and after the exhaustive analysis of the three gunas, those fundamental qualities of nature that the Samkhya philosophy calls sattva, rajas, and tamas, the tendencies toward clarity, toward activity, toward inertia, which between them compose the entire texture of phenomenal existence. After all of that, after the philosophical system has been built to its fullest extension, Krishna pauses, and he says something that is not a continuation of the system, something that is, in a precise sense, the end of all systems. Sarva guhyatamam bhuya shrinhume paramam vacha. Hear from me again, my most confidential word, the highest of all that can be said. The commentarial tradition on the Bhagavad Gita is one of the most extensive in human intellectual history. Shankaracharya, writing in the 8th century of the Common Era, a period when the Kali Yuga's grip was already ancient and settled, wrote a commentary that has shaped Indian philosophy for more than 1,000 years. He read the final teaching through the lens of Advaita Vedanta, the non-dual understanding in which the individual self and the Supreme Self are not two things related to each other, but one thing in two modes of self-awareness. For Shankaracharya, the most confidential word is the declaration of non-difference, Tattvamasi, that art thou, the self that has been grieving, choosing, fighting, meditating, and striving to surrender. That self was always already the Supreme Self, looking at itself in the mirror of creation. Ramanujacharya, writing 3 centuries later, read it differently. For Ramanuja, whose Vishishtadvaita, the non-dualism of qualified oneness, sees the individual soul as real and genuinely distinct from the Supreme, if contained within it, the way a wave is genuinely distinct from the ocean, while being genuinely inseparable from it. For Ramanuja, the most confidential teaching is not identity, but relationship. The most confidential word is not "you are that," but "I love you." And this love is not contingent on your performance, or your understanding, or your readiness. And Madhvacharya, in the 13th century, the founder of Dvaita Vedanta, the philosophy of genuine and irreducible duality between the individual and the Supreme. For Madhva, the most confidential word is the declaration of Krishna's absolute supremacy and the soul's permanent, eternally beloved, eternally dependent relationship with it. And 3 of the greatest minds in the history of human thought. 3 readings of the same 2 verses. 3 readings that appear to contradict each other at the philosophical level. And yet, and this is the thing that the tradition itself seems to be pointing toward, if you step back far enough, all 3 are describing the same experience from different angles. The experience of something dissolving, something that had appeared to be a problem, the separation between the self and the sacred, between the small and the vast, between what you are and what you long for. That apparent problem revealing itself in the moment of the deepest reception, not to have been a problem at all, to have been rather the precise shape of the door through which you were always going to pass. The rishis encoded all three readings simultaneously, not by accident, not by imprecision, but because the most confidential word is not a proposition that can be held in a single philosophical frame. It is a reality that can only be pointed at from multiple angles simultaneously, the way you can only describe the inside of a sphere by pointing at it from many different points on its surface at once. Let the mind slow down now. Let the ideas stop arriving for a moment. There is something that happens when you let the 18th chapter breathe, when you stop reading it for content and start simply letting it be present in your awareness, the way music is present when you are not analyzing it. Something happens that no commentary fully captures. The chapter itself, in its original Sanskrit, has a quality that the tradition calls Shabda Brahman. Shabda means sound or word, and Brahman means the supreme reality. Shabda Brahman means the supreme reality as sound, the understanding, and this understanding runs through the Rig Veda, through the Upanishads, through the Yoga Sutras of Patanjali, through the entire tradition of Nada Yoga, the understanding that sound is not merely a vibration in the air, but a mode of being, a way that consciousness manifests and knows itself, a transmission that operates simultaneously at the level of meaning and at a level that is prior to meaning, the way music operates simultaneously in your mind and in your body and in something that is neither. The Vedic tradition holds that every word of the Vedas is not a human composition, but what is called Shruti, literally that which was heard, not invented, received. The rishis in their states of samadhi were not generating ideas. They were attending to what was already there, in the silence that underlies all sound, and allowing it to be heard through them, the way a particular valley allows the wind to be heard as a particular note. The Bhagavad Gita, in this understanding, is not a text that contains truths. It is a transmission that is truth, operating at the level of Shabda itself. And when you hear it, even in translation, even imperfectly, even through the static of a Kali Yuga mind, something in you that is below the level of the conscious mind responds. The way a tuning fork placed near another tuning fork of the same frequency vibrates without being struck. The resonance happens below the threshold of decision. This is why the rishis preserved it so carefully. Not because of its philosophical content, though the philosophical content is extraordinary. It's because of what it does, because of its function as a live transmission from a source that does not age, pass through a medium, the Sanskrit language, the poetic meter of the shlokas, the specific sequence of teachings that was designed with this function in mind. The Samaveda, the Veda of song, of chant, of the voice raised in the specific tonal patterns that the Seers had found to be most permeable to the divine. The Samaveda holds, in its foundational teaching, that different sound patterns open different layers of reality, that the right sequence of sounds, offered with the right quality of attention, can part the veil between the ordinary and the sacred, the way a key parts a lock, not by force, by correspondence, by the resonance of the receiver with what it was built to receive. And the 18 chapters of the Bhagavad Gita are composed in this understanding. Each chapter is not just an argument. Each chapter is a tuning, a progressive adjustment of the receiver's frequency until, by the time the final verses arrive, the listener, if they have followed with genuine attention rather than merely intellectual processing, has been moved, without quite knowing it, into a state of receptivity that is qualitatively different from where they began. This is what the Seers encoded, not just content, a technology of transmission, and the final verses are what the technology was built to deliver. Bhagavad Gita 18.65 says, Manmana bhava madbhakto madhyaji mam namaskuru. Let your mind be fixed on me. be devoted to me, worship me, bow to me, and then, mam evaisyasya satyam te pratijane priyosime, to me alone you shall come. I promise you truly, you are dear to me. 4 instructions and a promise in 2 lines of Sanskrit, from a god to a human being. The instruction itself is, on its surface, simple enough to seem almost naive. Let your mind be fixed on me, be devoted, worship, bow. These sound like the instructions you might give to someone entering a temple for the first time. Elementary, preliminary, the basics of a devotional practice. And yet every great commentator who has touched these verses recognizes that something else is happening here, that the words are not being used in their ordinary sense, that mam, me, does not mean a deity in the conventional sense, that the devotion being asked for is not a feeling you produce in yourself by effort, that the worship is not a ceremony, that the bowing is not a physical act. The Bhagavata Purana's 11th book, which scholars sometimes call the Uddhava Gita, because it is the teaching Krishna gave to his closest companion Uddhava just before the withdrawal, expands these 4 instructions into a vast and luminous teaching. And what it reveals, slowly, carefully, the way a dawn reveals a landscape that was always there but invisible in the dark, is that what Krishna is calling me in verse 18.65 is not his particular form, not even his divine nature, as he has revealed it across the 17 previous chapters. Me is the Atman, the self within the self, the watching bird that sits motionless on the branch while the eating bird searches for fruit. Me is what you are when you are not being anyone in particular. Let your mind rest in what you actually are. That is the instruction. That is the most confidential teaching. Not because it is complex, because it is the one thing the mind cannot do by being more mind. It can only happen when the mind exhausts its strategies, and in that exhaustion, discovers that the stillness it finds there is not absence. It is presence. It is the presence that was always the ground of all the mind's activity, patient, vast, luminous, unchanged by anything the mind has ever thought or felt or done. You are dear to me, says the God. And the tradition holds that this phrase, priyosi me, is not a consolation. It is a fact of metaphysics. You are dear to the source of all being because you are not separate from the source of all being. The distance between you and what you long for is not a distance to be crossed. It is a distance to be recognized as the illusion it always was. And now here is the turn that the greatest commentators arrive at and then mostly step away from, because it is the one that seems to exceed what even their extraordinary capabilities can fully contain. The verse immediately following, 18.66, is explicitly called by the tradition the Karama Shloka, the final, ultimate, supreme verse of the entire Gita. It reads, Sarva Dharman Parityaja Mam Ekam Sharanam Vraja Aham Tvam Sarva Papebhyo Mokshayishami Ma Shucha. Abandon all forms of Dharma and take refuge in me alone. I will liberate you from all sins. Do not grieve. This verse has generated more controversy, more divergence of interpretation, more passionate and sometimes bitter scholarly disagreement than perhaps any other 2 lines in Sanskrit literature. Because of that first word, parityaja, abandon, relinquish, let go. Abandon all dharmas. This is not what you expect a god to say at the end of a teaching that began with the assertion that Arjuna must fulfill his dharma. This is not what you expect from a text that has spent 17 chapters carefully constructing a comprehensive philosophy of right action, right knowledge, right devotion. This is not the expected conclusion of the argument, and that is precisely the point. The commentators who read parityaja as abandon all secondary dharmas and hold to the supreme dharma of surrender are not wrong. They are protecting the verse from misreading, preventing the casual conclusion that the Gita ends in a kind of antinomianism, a permission to discard ethics and structure and effort. Shankaracharya, Ramanuja, Madhva, all of them perform some version of this interpretive protection. But there is another reading, the reading that emerges when you have sat with the verse long enough to let it say what it seems to actually be saying, which is, there comes a moment, not a philosophical conclusion, but an actual lived moment, when every frame through which you have been experiencing yourself, including the most refined and the most sacred, must be released, not dismissed, not devalued, released, the way the breath must be released after the longest, deepest inhale. Because what is on the other side of the release is not emptiness. It is the inhale that follows. It is the Atman recognized. It is the source contacted. It is what was always the case, seen clearly for perhaps the first time. Do not grieve, says the God. And these final words, Mashucha, do not grieve, are the same words he began with, are in the second chapter, when Arjuna was sitting in the chariot with his bow falling from his hands. The teaching has turned full circle, but the one who has traveled the circle is not the same as the one who set out on it. Something has been installed. Something has been planted below the level of the ego's knowing, in the ground of the Atman itself, where it waits with the patience of something that has no need of time. The Seers encoded this. They preserved it across millennia. They carried it through the darkening ages, like a lamp through a very long, dark corridor, knowing that the light was not theirs, that they were not the lamp, only the hands that held it, but holding it anyway, with everything they had, all the way to this moment. But what of the ones who remained? After Krishna departed, after the signal moved from the visible to the invisible, who stayed? Who were the keepers of the flame in the world that followed? Who are the ones, if any, who still walk this earth carrying the transmission intact? The tradition has a word for them. And that is exactly where we are going next. There is a teaching in the Atharva Veda, buried in its fourth book, between hymns for healing and hymns for protection against unseen forces, that speaks of what the tradition calls the akshara, the indestructible, the syllable that cannot be erased. It says that certain sounds, once spoken with sufficient power and with sufficient truth, do not dissolve when the speaking ends. They enter the fabric of things. They become part of the structure of what is real, vibrating at a frequency below what ordinary hearing can detect, detectable only when the air around you becomes very still, and something in your own depths becomes correspondingly still in response. The tradition holds that this is also true of certain beings, that certain presences, once they have been brought into existence by the intersection of great karma and great grace, and once they have been touched, directly, personally, through the medium of an actual relationship, by the source of all rasa, cannot simply dissolve when the world changes around them. They become what the Atharva Veda calls akshara, indestructible, not because they refuse to change. Change is the nature of everything that exists in time, but because what is most essential in them has been permanently altered by the contact, has been tuned to a frequency that the Kali Yuga, for all its noise and density, cannot fully override. The tradition has a name for these beings, Chiranjeevi, the long-lived, the ones who remain. The Puranas list the Chiranjeevis with the kind of precision that suggests the tradition knows exactly who it is talking about, not as metaphor, not as symbolic representation, but as an actual roster of presences who continue to move through the world in ways that most of the world cannot perceive. The Vishnu Purana names them. The Bhagavata Purana elaborates their qualities, and the oral traditions that flow beneath and around these texts, in the rivers of memory that run through India's sacred geography, speak of encounters, always indirect, always charged with a quality that the person who experienced them could not afterward explain away. Encounters with beings who carried something in them that the ordinary world does not carry. Let us begin with Hanuman. The Ramayana gives us Hanuman as the incomparable devotee of Rama, that earlier avatar of the Supreme who preceded Krishna in the Treta Yuga, when the world still held more of the light than it does now. What the Ramayana gives us as across the extraordinary chapters of the Sundara Kanda and the Yuddha Kanda is a being whose devotion is so absolute, so structurally complete, that it has ceased to be a feeling and become a fact of his being. Hanuman does not feel devotion to Rama the way you might feel warmth toward a beloved friend. He is devotion. In the same way that the ocean is not something that contains water, but is the water itself, Hanuman does not contain Bhakti as one quality among others. His entire structure, physical and subtle and causal, is a perfect expression of what Bhakti looks like when nothing at all is held back. The Bhagavata Purana and the later Puranic traditions hold that Hanuman received a direct blessing from Rama, a blessing that is, when you understand its content, one of the most astonishing things in all of sacred literature. He was asked what he wished for, and Hanuman, who could have asked for liberation, who could have asked for merger with the Supreme, who could have asked for any of the states of consciousness that the highest teachings offer, Hanuman asked to remain, to stay in the world as long as the name of Rama was spoken anywhere in creation, to be present as a witness and as a protector at every place in every age where the sacred transmission was being passed from one being to another. Think carefully about what this means. It means that wherever the Ramayana is recited, in a temple at dawn, in a village gathering at dusk, in a radio broadcast, in a recording heard through earphones late at night by someone who is not quite sure why they are listening but cannot stop, Hanuman is said, by the tradition, to be present, not as a historical figure remembered, as a living presence attending the transmission, the way a devoted student attends every lecture of a teacher they love, without exception, without fatigue, across an interval of time that the human mind cannot hold without vertigo. The Ramayana itself seems to know this. It says, in one of its most quietly extraordinary verses, that in any assembly where the story of Rama is told with love, Kavyam Ramayanam Kritsnam Sitayayam, Rama himself descends to be present in the listening. The teller and the tradition, and the hero of the story, and the supreme reality underlying all three collapse, for the duration of the telling, into a single event. A transmission happens, and Hanuman, whose very being is the transmission, is there. Now consider Vyasa, the sage Krishna Dvaipayana Vyasa, who is said to be an avatar of Vishnu himself, appearing in each age specifically to organize and preserve the sacred knowledge for the beings of that age, is named in the tradition as a Chiranjeevi. And what Vyasa did with his vast, singular life was this. He saw the coming of the Kali Yuga before it arrived, the way a sailor feels a change in the wind before the horizon shows any sign of storm. He felt the contraction approaching in the very fabric of awareness. He felt the capacity of human beings to hold and transmit and receive the sacred beginning, to narrow, the way a river narrows as it approaches a drier landscape. And he made a decision that changed everything. He took the single, undivided Veda, that primordial body of Shruti, the hard wisdom, and the transmission that had passed from the source through the rishis, and from the rishis through their students in an unbroken line, and he organized it into four: Rig Veda, Samaveda, Yajur Veda, Atharva Veda. 4 bodies of knowledge, each accessible to a different kind of mind, each representing a different mode of engagement with the sacred, collectively covering the full range of human approaches to the real. He did this not because the Veda had changed, but because the capacity of the receiver had changed. The signal was the same. The antenna needed to be reconfigured. And then, knowing that even 4 Vedas would not be enough, that the Kali Yuga mind would struggle with the condensed, technically demanding language of the Vedic hymns, he composed the Mahabharata, 18 books, 100,000 verses, a narrative vast enough to contain every human situation, every moral complexity, every quality of consciousness, from the most base to the most luminous, all organized around the single question that the Bhagavad Gita asks at its center. When the world has become a battlefield, and the people you love are arrayed against the people you love, and no action available to you is free of consequence, what do you do? Who are you? What is real? The Mahabharata begins with a verse that declares its own comprehensiveness. Whatever is here is found elsewhere. Whatever is not here is nowhere. This is not boasting. It is a description of the text's function. The Mahabharata is not a story that contains teachings. It is a transmission mechanism that uses story as its carrier wave. And because story is the one mode of transmission that the human mind will carry willingly across long distances of time and distraction, turning the transmission over and over in memory, finding new layers in it each time, the way a river turns a stone. And within the Mahabharata, like a lamp carried at the center of a vast procession, is the Bhagavad Gita. Vyasa put it there knowing exactly what it was, knowing that the Charama Shloka, the ultimate verse, would be passed through his text into every age and every condition, reaching beings who would never have access to the original setting, who would never stand on the actual field of Kurukshetra, who would never hear the original Sanskrit in its original sonic context, but who might, in the right conditions, in the right quality of listening, to receive the resonance of the transmission, even through all those layers of mediation. He carried the lamp. He placed it where it could not easily be extinguished. And then there is Ashwatthama. This is the Chiranjeevi that the tradition speaks of with the most careful and complex attention, because Ashwatthama carries in his immortality not triumph, but wound. He is the son of Drona, the great teacher of the Mahabharata warriors, the man who taught both the Pandavas and the Kauravas the arts of warfare, and who died in the war his students fought against each other. After the battle was over, after the Pandavas had won, and Krishna had spoken his final words on the field, Ashwatthama committed an act of such violence, attacking the sleeping camp of the Pandavas, killing the sons of Draupadi, that the curse that fell on him was this: he would remain alive. He would carry his wound for the length of the Kali Yuga itself. A gem had been set in his forehead at birth, marking his divine origin. That gem was taken from him. Where it had been, a wound remained. And that wound, the tradition says, does not heal, cannot heal, not until the age turns. There is something in this teaching that the comfortable readings of the Chiranjeevi tradition tend to skip past, because it complicates the narrative of the remaining ones as purely luminous presences. Ashwatthama's immortality is not a reward, it is itself a teaching. And the teaching is this, that in the Kali Yuga, even the sacred knowledge carried in a being who has genuine divine lineage, even that knowledge can be turned, and by grief and rage and the loss of a beloved father, toward destruction rather than liberation. The capacity is real, the wound is real, both are true simultaneously. The Kali Yuga does not divide the world neatly into the illumined and the unillumined. It creates conditions in which even the greatest capacities are under pressure, in which even beings of extraordinary origin carry both the transmission and the wound, in which the lamp sometimes gutters, even in the hands of those who were born to carry it. This is not pessimism. This is precision, and the precision matters, because the Bhagavad Gita's final teaching, the Karama Shloka, the most confidential word, was given specifically for beings in exactly this condition, not for perfected sages who have already transcended all conflict. For Arjuna, and with his grief and his confusion and his resistance and his love. For you, with whatever combination of luminosity and wound you are carrying into this particular night. Sit in the stillness of that for a long moment. The tradition does not ask you to be Hanuman before you can receive the transmission. It does not ask you to be Vyasa before the teaching can take root in you. It asks only what the Karama Shloka asks: come, as you are, with the wound as well as the light, with the confusion as well as the clarity. I will liberate you from all of it. Do not grieve. The Katha Upanishad speaks of the Atman as something so subtle that it cannot be grasped by the eye, or by speech, or by the senses, or by ascetic practice, or by ritual action. There is only one way it becomes accessible, and the Upanishad gives that way in a phrase of such delicate precision that it has lived in the memory of everyone who has ever truly heard it. Yam evaisha vrinut tena labhya. It is attained only by the one it chooses, and to that one it reveals its own nature. You are listening tonight, in this particular darkness, with this particular quality of attention. That is not an accident. That is not a coincidence. The tradition would say, and this is not sentiment, this is the metaphysics, that you are listening because something in you recognized the frequency. Something below the level of conscious choice, below the level of the preferences and habits that constitute your ordinary self. Something that has been oriented toward this direction for longer than this lifetime accounts for. The Chiranjeevis remain in the world because the transmission must not be broken, because there must always be at least one living presence that has been directly touched by the source, and that carries that touch forward, and that makes the contact available, indirectly, through the medium of story and text, and the right quality of silence, to everyone who arrives at the right kind of listening. You have arrived at the right kind of listening. Something is here with you. This is what the Seers meant when they said the signal never stopped. But a question remains, one that you may have been carrying since the beginning of this story, through all the chapters, through all the teachings, and the departures, and the ones who remained. A question that is perhaps the most intimate of all the questions this story contains. Why are you hearing this now, in this age, in this moment, in the particular configuration of circumstances and choices and accidents that has made you the person who is listening to this on this night? Why does it feel, if you let yourself be honest about it, as if this was somehow meant for you? That is the final chapter. That is the promise. There is a moment in the Bhagavad Gita that almost no commentary stops to fully examine, because it happens before the teaching begins. It is the moment that sets the context for everything that follows, and when you finally see it, it reorganizes the entire text. Sanjaya, the minister who has been gifted divine vision by Vyasa, so that he can see and hear everything occurring on the battlefield of Kurukshetra from a distance, says this, not to Arjuna, not to Krishna, but to the blind king Dhritarashtra, who is sitting in a palace far from the field, dependent entirely on Sanjaya's narration to know what is happening. Vyasa prasadat shrutavan etad guhyam aham param yogam yogesvarat krishnat sakshat katayata svayam. By the grace of Vyasa, I heard this supreme and most secret yoga directly from Krishna, the master of all yoga, as he himself was speaking it. Sanjaya heard the Bhagavad Gita, not Arjuna, or rather, Arjuna heard it as the one to whom it was addressed, but Sanjaya heard it too, at a distance, through the medium of a gift of perception that had been given to him by a sage who understood that the transmission must reach more than one receiver. And then Sanjaya transmitted it again to the Dhritarashtra verbally, in real time. And the Dhritarashtra transmitted it, through his responses and reactions, to the tradition that eventually recorded the entire exchange and made it the Mahabharata's Bhishma Parva. Every transmission of the Bhagavad Gita since then has been, in this sense, a repetition of what Sanjaya did. Someone heard it, and then told someone else, and that someone else told someone else. The chain has not broken. The lamp has been carried, sometimes in steadier hands, and sometimes in hands that trembled, through more than 3,000 years of the Kali Yuga's accumulated density. And it has arrived, intact, at tonight, at this exact moment, at you. The Bhagavata Purana's 12th book, its final book, the one that addresses the Kali Yuga directly, and that does not flinch from describing the darkness of this age in terms that would be uncomfortable if they were not so clearly accurate. This book contains a passage that has the quality of a letter written to someone the author knows will not arrive to read it for a very long time. It describes the conditions of the Kali Yuga with the precision of a physician describing a disease, the reduction of lifespan, the degradation of spiritual practice, the dominance of materialism, the confusion of means and ends, the loss of the thread that connects the ordinary to the sacred. It describes, in other words, the world as it is, the world you have lived inside for the entirety of your life. And then, having named all of this without evasion, it does something extraordinary. It says, Kalar dosha nidhe rajan, astihi eko mahanguna. O king, in the ocean of faults, that is the Kali Yuga, there exists one great virtue, in an ocean of faults. And then, it names the virtue, Kirtanad eva Krishnasya mukta sangha param vrajet. Simply by the recitation of the name of Krishna, one becomes free from the bonds of material existence and reaches the supreme state. Simply by the recitation of the name. This is the promise encoded for the Kali Yuga, not a demanding promise, requiring purity of life or freedom from distraction or years of disciplined practice before you are worthy of approaching it. A simple one, a promise that operates at the level of resonance rather than achievement. The name carries the frequency. The frequency is the transmission. The transmission reaches, if you let it, below the noise of everything the Kali Yuga has accumulated in you, below the habits and the fears and the identities and the plans and the regrets, and touches what was always already there, the Atman, the watching bird, the fire of which the sparks are made. The Kali Santarana Upanishad, a short text, small enough to hold in both hands, which seems to have been composed precisely for this age and precisely for this kind of listener, speaks of how, when the sage Brahma was asked what practice was adequate to the conditions of the Kali Yuga, he replied not with a system or a ceremony, but with 16 words. The 16 names of what the Vaishnava traditions call the Maha Mantra, Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, 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 Hare Hare. And the Upanishad says that these 16 names are the Taraka Brahman, the Brahman that carries a cross, the raft that functions even in a flood. Not because the words are magical in the mechanical sense, not because repeating them produces a transaction, but because they are, in the understanding of the tradition, an encoding of the rasa itself in sonic form. The same rasa that the gopis of Vrindavan experienced when the flute music came across the river. The same rasa that the Bhagavata Purana spent 12 books trying to convey in narrative. The same rasa that Krishna himself was and is and will always be, now made available in a form that the Kali Yuga mind can hold without requiring the Kali Yuga mind to be different from what it is first. You carry it without knowing you carry it. Every time you have ever felt, without cause or preparation, a sudden opening in the chest, a moment of inexplicable beauty, a quality of presence that made ordinary life temporarily sacred, a stillness that arrived between thoughts and held for a few seconds before the noise returned. That was the transmission making contact. That was the frequency finding the receiver, the way sunlight finds an opening in cloud. Sit with that. Let it rest in you like a hand placed gently over a candle flame, not smothering it, just cupping it from the wind. Think of the ocean. Think of how the surface of the ocean, on the most turbulent day, with waves crashing and wind tearing and rain breaking the surface into chaos. Think of how all of that turbulence, all of that noise and violence and disorder extends downward only so far. 100 feet below the worst storm the ocean's surface has ever endured, the water is still. The stillness is not an absence of the storm. The storm is happening above it, real and powerful, and the stillness is happening below it, real and powerful. They are not contradictions. They are the same water at two different depths. The Kali Yuga is the storm on the surface. The Atman is the stillness below. And what the Bhagavad Gita's final teaching is pointing at, what the most confidential word is, when you sit with the Karama Shloka long enough for it to stop being a proposition and start being a direct pointing, is this: you are not the storm. You never were. The storm is the mind's experience, real and sometimes overwhelming, and also absolutely not the whole of what you are. Come to me, says the God, not to a place, not to a state you must manufacture, not to a condition of purity or adequacy that you must achieve before you are eligible. Come to what is already present, below the storm. That is me. That is you. These are not two things. Now the counterintuitive heart of everything this entire story has been moving toward, the thing that only becomes audible in the 6th chapter, after the journey through the golden world, and the first cracks, and the cosmic withdrawal, and the Seers encoding, and the ones who remained. The counterintuitive truth is this: you are not a passive recipient of a teaching that exists somewhere outside you. You are a participant in its transmission. Every time you carry even the faintest resonance of what you have heard tonight into the next moment, into the next conversation, the next difficulty, the next instance of standing at the threshold between the life you have been living and the life that is being asked of you, you become, whether you intend it or not, a link in the chain that Sanjaya began. Another hand holding the lamp. Another voice in the transmission that has been passing through human beings since before history began to be recorded. The Bhagavata Purana closes its account of Krishna's life with a verse that has the quality of a seal pressed into warm wax, something final and permanent, and also, paradoxically, still warm. Idam Bhagavatam, Nama Puranam, Brahma Samitam, Uttama Shloka Charitam, Chakasa Bhagavan Svai. This Bhagavatam, equal to the Vedas, composed of the most exalted verses concerning the character of the Supreme. The Bhagavan himself set it in motion. He set it in motion. Not Vyasa, though Vyasa was the instrument. Not the transmission lineage, though the transmission lineage was the chain. The source itself set it in motion at the moment it decided to speak the most confidential word to a grieving warrior on a battlefield at the edge of an age. And that motion has not stopped, cannot stop, because what was set in motion was not a text or a tradition or a philosophy. What was set in motion was a recognition, a resonance, a frequency that, once established in the fabric of awareness, simply continues, the way a bell continues to vibrate long after the hand that struck it has moved away. You are inside that vibration tonight. You were inside it before you knew what it was. The Brihadaranyaka Upanishad ends, after hundreds of pages of some of the most demanding philosophical inquiry ever set in writing, with a passage that has nothing demanding about it at all. It is simply this: Shanti, Shanti, Shanti. Peace, peace, peace. 3 times, because the tradition understands that there are 3 levels of turbulence: the turbulence of the outer world, the turbulence of the body, and the turbulence of the mind, and that each requires its own addressing, its own quieting, its own threshold to be crossed. The outer world has its storms. This is the condition of the Kali Yuga, and it is not yours to resolve tonight. The body has its tensions. Let them be noticed, acknowledged, gently released, the way the exhale at the end of a long day releases what the day accumulated. And the mind, right now, at this moment, in the particular quality of darkness and stillness that surrounds you, the mind has traveled a long way tonight. It has held questions that have no easy answers. It has been taken to the edge of what language can carry. It has stood, briefly, at the threshold between the story of a God who walked the earth 3,000 years ago and the recognition that what that God was and what you are, and what the stillness that holds you tonight is, are not, at the deepest level, three separate things. Let that rest now, not as a conclusion, as a presence. The fire does not need you to tend it tonight. It has been burning since before the Kali Yuga began, and it will be burning when the Kali Yuga ends, and it is burning right now, low and constant and patient, in the deepest layer of what you are. Seeds are waiting below the frozen ground. The signal has never stopped broadcasting. The lamp is still lit. We began with a question. What is the most secret thing a god has ever said? We have traveled through golden ages and battlefields, through cosmic withdrawals and the long patience of the ones who remained, through the layered architecture of what the rishis preserved and why they preserved it, and how it has continued to find its way across distances of time and culture, and the Kali Yuga's formidable noise, into the ears of those who were somehow, through some configuration of longing and karma and the grace that operates below all categories, somehow ready to receive it. And the answer is not a verse. It is not a philosophy. It is not even, in the end, a secret in the ordinary sense. Something hidden from those who do not have access and revealed only to the chosen. The most confidential word in all of creation is confidential, not because it is guarded, but because it is the one thing that cannot be delivered from outside. It can only be recognized from within. And the recognition, when it comes, is not dramatic. It does not arrive with the sound of conches or the descent of flowers from the Devas. It arrives in the way that something long forgotten arrives when the conditions are finally right, quietly, with a quality of inevitability, the way the dawn arrives not as an event, but as a gradual and patient reclaiming of what was always the nature of the sky. What Krishna said to Arjuna in the final verses of the Bhagavad Gita was this: "You are already what you have been searching for. Come home." That is all. That is everything. You are listening to this in the dark. Perhaps you are already at the edge of sleep, that particular threshold where the conscious mind begins to loosen its grip on its versions of things, and something older and quieter surfaces in the space the grip leaves behind. This is not an accident. Sleep, the tradition holds, is itself a kind of samadhi, an unconscious return to the ground of being, a nightly dissolution of the surface self into the depth from which it arose. Every night, without effort, without practice, without deserving it, you return. What the Bhagavad Gita's final teaching asks of you, in its most intimate and most direct address, is simply this: carry into that return, tonight, a thread, the thinnest possible thread of recognition, not belief, not certainty, not understanding. It's even, just the faintest quality of recognition, that the stillness you're about to enter is not absence, that the self that dissolves at the threshold of sleep is not everything you are, that what remains when the mind goes quiet is not nothing. It is the watching bird. It is the source. It is what the charioteer was beneath the charioteer. It is what you are beneath everything you have believed yourself to be. The signal is broadcasting. It has always been broadcasting. And tonight, in the particular quality of your listening, the receiver is aligned. The antenna is pointing in the right direction. And what is coming through, below the noise, below the questions, below the beautiful and difficult story we have told together across these hours, what is coming through is the one thing that was always coming through, if only the conditions were right enough to feel it. Sarva dharman parityaja mam ekam sharanam vraja. Let everything else rest. Come to what is. Go gently into your rest tonight, knowing this: the most confidential word was never kept from you. It was waiting, with the patience of something that exists outside of time, for this exact moment, when you were still enough, and open enough, and tired enough of the storm's surface, to hear it said, in the only way it can truly be said, in the silence that holds you now, like hands cupped around the low and faithful flame of what you have always already been.